Jim Powell, a moderately aged man, describes the main episode of the series. He works as a police craftsman and is fairly disappointed with his family, and calling his researcher spouse Stephanie really buckles down for an enormous logical organization called Worldwide Tech, as she's at present doing explore on a strange plant. Daphne and JJ, his two high school youngsters, are continually on their telephones. What's more, lack the capacity to deal with exercises like playing get with their dad. They are losing the ties that a run-of-the-mill family ought to have among themselves. Tired, Jim pursues the choice that they will all go with mother on her exploration outing to Brazil so they can all go through some family time together. Jim recommends that they take a trip over the Amazon rainforest while they're voyaging. However, things don't work out as expected due to moving toward storm. The plane compelled to land in the sea, which is to some degree sparkling with little neon particles. Luckily, Jim's family is safe. However, their pilot isn't really fortunate. In the following scene, Jim and his family are back home carrying on with their different existences once more. Subsequent to getting back from the outing, Jim is back working at the area where he converses with a female investigator Cho about a case. As they're talking, a fellow in the station abruptly gets an official's weapon and focuses it at the investigator. Jim sees this and plunges to push her far removed, saving her. Anyway, the weapon actually goes off after a while. Analyst Cho gets up and ponders where the slug is. Jim then pardons himself and thoroughly searches in his grasp. There's the projectile. Evidently he got the projectile with his own hand without getting hurt. Jim is stunned to grasp what simply happened. He then, at that point, goes to a batting enclosure to investigate what could have simply happened to him. He warns the security fellow and figures out how to have the entire spot for him for an hour. Set the pitching machine to 90 miles each hour. He shockingly gets pitches without an issue. Then he speeds up to 140 miles each hour. Still no issue. Just then, at that point, his dearest companion and partner George, who is a lead prosecutor, shows up and Jim gives him a weapon. George isn't excited about shooting Jim, however he coincidentally shoots the firearm and Jim gets the shot again. The two of them are left in absolute skepticism by what simply occurred. In the interim, Stephanie is in a quandary. She needs to have a decent supper with Jim, yet work is requesting her consideration. She has to get across town for a work meeting. However, the traffic is extremely terrible. Having no other choice, she begins running, and this is the point at which she goes increasingly fast. She zooms past vehicles on the interstate and figures out how to get to the workplace on time. It seems like Stephanie has additionally gotten a few new capacities. Back at the lab, she informs her lab tech Katie and they go to an ice horsing track to test her capacities. While Stephanie starts to run on the track, Katie with a radar weapon peruses that Stephanie's speed is in the walloping 700-mile-each-hour range. With her freshly discovered capacity, Stephanie hurries back home to assist her child JJ with schoolwork as he has a learning handicap. Meanwhile, Jim and George show up at a housestop. George is persuaded that Jim has one more superpower too, that he can fly. Jim is distrustful yet surrenders. What's more, leaps off the housestop. Tragically, his hunch ends up being valid and he drops to the ground, making a gigantic cavity in it. When he gets up, he takes a gander at the highest point of the structure and jumps back to the rooftop. This makes Jim understand that despite the fact that he can't fly, he can jump like an insane superhuman. As the two men return to their vehicle, their police scanner snaps. Incidentally, a person who's been burglarizing adornment stores is being sought after midtown. Jim starts to jump that way. He winds up getting the person in a rear entryway. However, previously he can curb him. The troublemaker's accomplice unexpectedly shoots him toward the rear of the head. Jim hauls the shot out of his head, yet he is draining. Prior to falling oblivious, he considers George for help. The following morning, Jim awakens in bed to track down George and Stephanie before him. Stephanie asks him what wrong is and Jim at long last tells her, going on stunned. She likewise tells her spouse that she's gained godlike controls. In the meantime, their girl Daphne is having sweetheart difficulty at school. The class Beatty Sarah is hitting on him. Stressed, she converses with her companion Lindsay about it later. As Daphne plays in her b-ball game, she begins to hear everybody's contemplations. Monstrosities her out, so she calls her folks to get her from school. Daphne then, at that point, educates her mother concerning her having the option to guess individuals' thoughts. This makes Stephanie understand that even her little girl has acquired some sort of capacity. Slice to the next scene. The Powells require a family meeting. They discover that everybody has some sort of force with the exception of poor JJ. The following day anyway, while JJ is taking a numerical test, things begin to shine on the board and the responses for the test show up directly before him. He grins also, rapidly gets everything on paper somewhere else. Daphne meets her beau, and as they kiss she can peruse his considerations. She tragically discovers that he's laying down with her closest companion Lindsay. She surges out, leaving him uncertain how she knew that he was undermining her working. Jim draws an image of the gem cheat in light of the battle with him in the back street. He then runs the image through facial acknowledgement. Also figures out how to get an ID in light of his data analyst Cho and her partner get ready to find the cheat. Before they leave the area, they advise Jim to remain behind since he's simply a craftsman and not a wrongdoing contender. At the point when the analysts appear at the hoodlum's loft, a shootout follows and analyst Cho winds up in the storage compartment of his vehicle. When the criminal is going to drive off, Jim shows up there. They start to battle, however this time the gem criminal is prepared for him. Jim strikes at him, yet the criminal shockingly evaporates and returns in the back. The criminal then, at that point, lets Jim know that he's not alone, who has superpowers. They proceed battling, with Jim always being unable to land a spotless punch on the troublemaker. This is until the hoodlum winds up behind Jim with a firearm pointed at his neck. Unexpectedly a shot rings out. Fortunately it's from criminal investigator Cho. It just so happens she figured out how to step out of the storage compartment and shoot the troublemaker. It's uncovered that she didn't see Jim's superpower, so she tells him to leave before inward undertakings begins posing inquiries. Subsequently the scene movements to a mortuary where a puzzling man, who shockingly turns out to be Stephanie, his supervisor from Worldwide Tech, lets his partner Morgan know that they ought to kill the individual behind the cheat's demise. The next day Jim keeps on attempting to battle wrongdoing by jumping to a bank theft. He winds up in a rear entryway with the looters driving a van straight for him. He then chooses to stop the van, yet gets run over. All things being equal, interim Stephanie and her lab aide Katie work on getting a water test from the Amazon stream where the plane crash happened. Stephanie believes that the water has something to do with her and her family's superpower. Once back at home, Stephanie begins doing house errands on super speed. She then, at that point, accepts she has time for everything. In the meantime, her child JJ begins improving on his tests in light of the fact that, very much like his family, he presently has a super mental ability. One day in the library, Daphne hears her sibling learning complex geometry speculations. She is amazed to see him there, as he was never into. Concentrates on JJ at long last, opens up to inform her concerning his power. However, he does admit that he hasn't told their guardians since they were so pleased with him after he excelled on the tests. Feeling terrible, Daphne says she'll keep his secret later. After the ringer rings, JJ's instructor blames him for undermining the last couple of tests in light of the fact that the youngster generally bombed on his numerical tests. However, presently he's getting straightens accordingly. JJ blows him away with some perplexing math talk, yet his instructor actually needs to talk to his folks about his cheating. A short time later, Jim converses with JJ about the tests. Tragically, JJ gets the feeling that his father believes he's cheating as well and stomps off. The next day, Morgan, the man from the funeral home who was companions with the now dead criminal, comes into the police station and converses with analyst Cho. He inquires as to whether she saw anything abnormal or, on the other hand, surprising about the bank looter she shot last week. The analyst takes note something is off with a person, so she says she saw nothing abnormal. In the interim, George is doing some police work with a sketch that Jim had drawn of the burglars. He then, at that point, goes to a bank. He accepts the criminal will focus straight away. While George is showing the sketch to a few watchers, the burglars appear with their firearms. George stows away and calls Jim, in spite of the fact that he figures out how to let his companion have some familiarity with the burglary. He is gotten by the looters and pushed into their van. Fortunately, Jim shows up at the scene just under the wire. At first he gets run over, however at that point recovers his level-headedness, gets the van and tosses it over. Jim then helps George out of the van. Similarly, as analyst Cho appears at seek after the looters, she is as yet confused about his power. Slice to the following scene. Stephanie and Katie concentrate on the water. They figured out how to recover from the Amazon. Much incredibly, they understand there's nothing mind-blowing about it, driving them to can't help thinking about what could really be the source of their powers. In the interim, analyst Cho gets back home to her loft and Morgan is they're sitting tight for her. It turns out he has supernatural power and uses it to gag her. He asks her or who else knows that the bank looter she shot last week had powers. Jo says she doesn't have the foggiest idea anything about it. Morgan lets her fall to the floor, yet compels her to point her own firearm towards her. Cho begins to crack out, and as Morgan escapes the loft, a shot is heard, evidently killing the analyst. He then calls Stephanie's manager at Worldwide Tech, telling him that Everything is dealt with. Cut to the following scene. The Powells go to a companion's wedding anyway. A lot of looters crash the wedding, inquiring everybody to place their gems in a crate. The hoodlums likewise take Stephanie's wedding band. However, the Powells choose not to utilize their superpower to get back at the burglars, understanding that they would be putting their lives in danger. The following day, Stephanie figures out how to get the financing for her exploration at Worldwide Tech. However, her chief tells her that as a feature of the subsidizing, they need to test her blood test for protection purposes. The organization as of now has her example, as it was required some investment back for a comparative task, understanding that her chief and the others would figure it out about her superpower once the blood is tried. Stephanie concocts an arrangement to switch her blood test with Katie's. Next scene, Daphne and her father Jim talk about how things are going. All of a sudden he gets a call from George about another wedding that is probably going to be looted. Thusly Jim deceives her that he has some crisis work at the area anyway. Since Daphne can guess thoughts, she finds out about his lies. That evening, Stephanie and Katie are at Worldwide Tech to switch a portion of Stephanie's blood tests. Katie has the course planned. Stephanie simply needs to break in without dialing back, or the cameras will see her. Moreover, she needs to swipe a critical card at a certain point. She figures out how to do that and move beyond the watchman without being seen. She then, at that point, effectively swipes the blood tests. Meanwhile, George and Jim are at the wedding. All at once the looters appear and Jim attempts to repress them. During this time he has chance, yet the projectiles don't chip away at him. The looters trust Jim to a cop wear a tactical armor, so they attempt to get away, however, not before he punches one of them. Oblivious, the burglars and Jim all rush out past Daphne, who is at the setting to see what her father was doing. Evidently her father is attempting to battle hoodlums, all without help from anyone else. When Jim sees that the burglars are moving away through a rope, he jumps up on a structure and figures out how to get one of them by the leg. The looter tumbles down onto a showing up cop vehicle, yet shockingly endures. When Jim returns home, Stephanie and Daphne are pausing for him, irate about his lying. Clearly they had guaranteed each other that they won't utilize their power until they truly understand what's befalling them. Jim lets them know that his powers are at long last allowing him to be the individual he needs to be. The next day at work, George tells Jim that they needed to relinquish the burglar exercise center got yesterday since they have no proof anyway. George doesn't have Stephanie's ring, which was recuperated at the scene. Meanwhile, Worldwide Tech's manager brings in a representative inquiring as to whether he was in the structure the other day, as his card was utilized to get to the lab. We understood that the card was taken